In the last lecture module, we saw how Kornblith frames this article by asking three questions. How ought we to form our beliefs? How do we form our beliefs? And do we form our beliefs as we ought to form our beliefs? He articulates three different positions in terms of how they prioritize and relate these questions one to the other. The first position, the independence thesis, represents traditional epistemology on Kornblith's account. It holds that philosophers get assigned the first question, how ought I form beliefs? Psychologists get assigned the second question, how do I form beliefs? And they meet together at some point later in time, confer with each other, and answer question number 3, do I form beliefs as I ought to form beliefs? The second position, the naturalistic approach, rejects the independence thesis. Instead, it asserts that answering question 1, how ought I form beliefs, and answering question 2, how do I form beliefs, should not be pursued independently and in isolation from one another. The third position, which Kornblith attributes to Quine, is the replacement thesis, and the replacement thesis also rejects the independence thesis. It asserts, however, that question 1, how ought I form beliefs, is an illegitimate question, that any content in that question is in fact included in question 2, how do I form beliefs? We saw that Kornblith attributes the replacement thesis to Quine, and that he attributes to Quine the foundationalism's failure argument in support of that thesis. Now we're going to look at a second argument that Kornblith attributes to Quine in support of the replacement thesis, what I call the rise of science argument. The rise of science argument essentially argues from an affirmative answer to question 3, do I form beliefs as I ought, to the claim that one need only answer question 2, how do I form beliefs? It goes something like this. The rise of science, for example, during the scientific revolution, first led to questions as to the limits and possibilities of knowledge. Thus, these questions arise from within science. Since these questions arise from within science, it's appropriate to seek answers to these questions from within science. Epistemology is continuous with the scientific enterprise rather than external to it. In specific, Kornblith suggests that one passage from Quine represents an instance of this argument in action. And within science, one finds encouragement from Darwin and evolution. Evolution suggests that creatures whose belief-forming mechanisms do not tend to lead to true beliefs have a pathetic but praiseworthy tendency to die before reproducing their kind. Kornblith suggests that the verdict of the Darwinian argument must be very strong to conclude the replacement thesis, i.e. that evolution has shaped us so that we, in fact, form all our beliefs exactly as we ought. Evolution optimizes on that view. It seeks the best or optimal solution. But one need not assume that evolution optimizes. If one supposes that evolution selects for systems generating sufficient levels of knowledge to survive, then selected systems form beliefs as they ought, and one ought to reject the idea that one has content independent of 2, i.e. that there is something over and above the description of my beliefs that would speak to whether or not I form beliefs as I ought. In other words, the argument construed this way says, what evolution selects for is how I ought to form beliefs. Hence, tautology, I form beliefs as I ought. There's another problem with this argument, though. This line of argument is never going to support the replacement thesis. It presupposes an answer to question 1, how ought I to form my beliefs, and probably to question 2, how do I in fact form my beliefs. That's the only way in which it can give an answer to 3, do I form beliefs as I ought. How else could we confidently assert that our belief-forming processes form beliefs as they ought? Thus, in order to plausibly assert 3, one must at least implicitly have an answer to 1, and probably to 2. As a result, the rise of science doesn't look like it supports the replacement thesis in anything like the fashion that Kornblith alleges that it does. We'll finish this lecture module by considering the third and final argument that Kornblith supposes Quine offers in favor of the replacement thesis. Kornblith notes that this argument can be found in the works of Davidson, Harman, and Dan Dennett as well, though not necessarily for the replacement thesis. Now, according to this argument, which we can call the rational presumption argument, we go from answering affirmatively question number 3, that is, do we form beliefs as we ought to form beliefs? Answer yes. To arguing that all we need answer then is question number 2, how do we form beliefs, and that we can reject or replace question number 1, how ought we form beliefs, with question 2. So let's look at how the argument unfolds. We must assume that there are principles of rationality that apply to all normal human beings. If normal human beings form their beliefs in accordance with rational principles, then clearly they form their beliefs as they ought. Hence, we must presume that we form beliefs as we ought. Now, that first premise, that seems like a pretty bold premise. So there's a supporting argument that's offered up in favor of that first premise. If we assume that we can make sense of the actions of normal human beings, and if we also assume that if normal human beings did not form beliefs in accordance with principles of rationality, i.e. they reasoned in a way fundamentally different from us, then they would be unintelligible to us. Hence, they must form beliefs in accordance with principles of rationality, which is premise RP1. Again, we should note that this line of argument is never going to support the replacement thesis. It presupposes an answer to 1 and probably 2. In other words, in order to assert that we form beliefs as we ought to, we already have to have a conception of how we ought to form beliefs and some at least general outline of how we do form beliefs. What makes this argument even worse as a potential argument for the replacement hypothesis is it doesn't even have any pretension of being a descriptive or empirically based argument. This is an argument about the nature of rational behavior given by philosophers without any reference to specific observations, experiments, etc., etc. So this strikes me as even more wildly off the mark as a potential argument in support of the replacement thesis. In the next lecture module, we'll turn our attention to Kornblith's distinction between the strong replacement thesis and the weak replacement thesis, between the weak replacement thesis and psychologism, and between psychologism and ballpark psychologism. Finally, I want to end the module by making sure that you're not getting confused or frustrated by what's going on in the lecture. As we're going through the lecture, you may find yourself feeling frustrated or confused because here I present a position and then I criticize it. Now I present an argument and then I criticize it. You may feel like, I'm not sure what I should be taking away from this. I'm not sure what the point is. What is the bottom line? What do I need to know to do well on the test? I want you to understand the arguments, how they fit together, how they build the overall thesis of Kornblith's paper. So understand Kornblith's paper, the components and how they fit together. I offer the criticism of the argument because we want to do more than simply master material. We want to engage with the material. When we go through and read a philosophy article, we should always be asking ourselves, do I believe this? Why don't I believe this? Is this a good argument? Is this a bad argument? What would the person say to this objection? What would the person say to this objection? We should always be thinking about the article, not just in terms of the article itself, but in terms of how we react to it, what our understanding of the article is, and our understanding of how effective the article executes its thesis. And in doing that, we'll come to understand the article in a much better way, and we'll also be able to start understanding the article in the overall context of the larger discipline in which the article is produced. It's not an easy thing to do. It's a difficult task. I can definitely understand if you feel frustrated as we go through. As I say, the most important thing for us as we go through this is that you understand the article and how the pieces fit together from beginning to end. But we can also have a higher aspiration to try and develop skills and ideas that help us do more than simply pass the course. We can aspire to develop the skills that facilitate critical and constructive engagement with ideas. These are skills that will help us in every class that we take and every activity in which we engage. The best philosophers that it was ever my privilege to meet, the people who I admire the most, were the philosophers who could cultivate more than just an understanding of the material. They could cultivate an understanding of what was at stake, why people were thinking about these issues, and what hung in the balance. And how do you cultivate that kind of knowledge? How do you cultivate that kind of ability to constructively interact with another person or a text? Well, I think that you do it because you don't just read through the article, but you understand how the article works, and you understand its strengths, its weaknesses, its relationships to other people and other theses within that same area. And so when I teach a class, I try to model these behaviors. I try to show how to constructively engage with the text, how to ask important questions about the thesis, about the arguments, about the relationship between this text and the next.